Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joelle Toubé. I'm the Communications Officer for Columbia Global Centers Paris, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's event, organized in partnership with Columbia University Press, featuring authors Dana R. Fisher and Joseph O'Neill. They'll be discussing Dana Fisher's most recent book, American Resistance: From the Women's March to the Blue Wave, as well as the upcoming US elections. This discussion will be moderated by Eric Schwartz, who is editorial director at Columbia University Press. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Columbia University Club of France, the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, the Alliance Program, Columbia Maison Française, Columbia Libraries, and Women's March Paris. And just a quick note about audience participation. There will be a 40-minute discussion followed by a 15 to 20-minute Q&A session. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our speakers. Thank you for being with us. And over to you, Eric.
Great, thank you very much, Joelle. We're here to talk about American resistance, looking back while marching forward, with Dana Fisher and Joseph O'Neill. And it's featuring Dana's book, American Resistance: From the Women's March to the Blue Wave, published by Columbia University Press in 2019. This talk is part of a series that we've been doing for several years now that we call Frankfurt in Paris. It's coordinated by Columbia University Press in conjunction with our friends at the Columbia Global Center in Paris at Reed Hall. And the series is typically held the Tuesday before the start of the Frankfurt Book Fair, which would have been last week. The Frankfurt Book Fair begins the following day. And it's intended to be a celebration of books and book publishing and the global exchange of ideas and information. And the fair has been going on since 1462 as a fair for printers. So it's a real long-running institution. The series has featured conversations related to books published by the press, and has thus far featured Vice, Crime, and Poverty by Dominique Khalifa, Creating a Learning Society by Bruce Greenwald and Joe Stiglitz, Tunisia by Safwan Masri, and Chicago Sociology by Jean-Michel Chapouli, who was in conversation with Howie Becker. And this event is coordinated by our colleagues at the Columbia Global Center in Paris, and we want to give special thanks to Joelle, the communications officer, for really helping us put this together. And mention as well another series that we do with the Global Center in Paris, moderated by Safwan Masri, who's the Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development. And this is called the Columbia Global Book Series of webinar events presented by the Global Centers, called In Conversation With. And the books featured thus far in this series have been Cities at War, co-edited by Saskia Sassen and Mary Kaldor, Away from Chaos by Gilles Capel, The Chili Pepper in China by Brian Dott, The Ages of Globalization by Jeff Sachs, and we're expecting future events with No Finish Line by Meyer Feldberg and Critique and Praxis by Bernard Harcourt. All the books that I mentioned are available in the United States through our website, cop.columbia.edu. So on to today's events. Dana Fisher's book, American Resistance, traces the activists from the streets back to the communities and congressional districts around the country where they live, work, and vote. Using innovative survey data and interviews with key players, she analyzes how resistance groups have channeled outrage into activism, using distributed organizing to make activism possible by anyone from anywhere, whenever and wherever it is needed most. Beginning with the first Women's March and following the movement through the 2018 midterms, Fisher demonstrates how the energy and enthusiasm of the resistance paid off in a wave of democratic victories. She reveals how the left rebounded from the devastating 2016 election, the lessons for turning grassroots passion into electoral gains, and what comes next. American Resistance explains the organizing that is revitalizing democracy to counter Trump's presidency. And with the presidential election less than 2 weeks away and a debate this evening, there is no more timely topic for us to discuss. So I'll just very briefly introduce our speakers and turn it over to them. Dana Fisher is a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland. Her research explores democracy, civic participation, activism, and environmental policymaking. She has written extensively on activism and protests, and American Resistance is her 6th book. Joseph O'Neill teaches at Bard, and he is the author of 6 books, including the novels The Dog, which was longlisted for the Booker Prize and was a New York Times notable book, and Netherland, which won the PEN/Faulkner Award, the Carey Fiction Prize, and was longlisted for the Booker Prize, and was a New York Times 10 Best Books for 2018, and is actually a personal favorite of mine. And his short stories have been published in The New Yorker and Harper's, and he writes about politics for the New Yorker Review of Books. So we'll begin with a brief presentation by Dana, followed by a conversation with Joseph O'Neill, and then take audience questions. So we'll turn it over to you, Dana.
Thank you, Eric. And I want to thank everybody for the efforts to bring this event together. It is very unfortunate we are not together in Paris right now, but still we can continue the conversation. So I'm going to share my screen and just go through a very brief overview of the contents of the book, as well as talk a little bit about how the findings of the book speak to what's going on right now in America, here where I'm sitting. All right, so the book asks 3 main questions, and if you want to know the full answer to these questions, you should check out the book, but I'm going to give you a little taste of what I talk about there. The questions are, how is civic engagement changing in this age of resistance? How are the resistance groups filling the infrastructural void on the left? And what is the connection between social movements and electoral politics, which is a question that is near and dear to my heart, as social scientists tend to bracket these different areas of research. And as a result, we don't tend to look at these connections, even though we need to. And just before I move any further along, I just want to provide my definition of the resistance, because people always ask about this, so you know who's in and who's out when I'm talking about it. This is what I say right in the beginning of the book. The American resistance is people working individually and through organizations to challenge the Trump administration and its policies. In many ways, the resistance is a counter movement to the Trump regime, like the Tea Party was a counter movement to the Obama administration and its policies. The fact that it's a counter movement with a common enemy makes it possible to bring diverse streams of progressive activism together, despite the fact that they have historically competed for resources, energy, and attention. So as Eric mentioned, the book starts in the streets. It actually starts at the Women's March, which took place, the first one took place the day after the inauguration of Donald Trump in January 2017. It was the largest protest in US history. That is the individual day of protest. And what was remarkable about the Women's March is that, as I talk about in the book, it was really the spark that ignited the resistance. And after the Women's March, there were numerous marches that took place through the midterms and actually beyond. And we'll talk about that for briefly right at the end here. But this is a list of kind of a timeline for the 2 years where I was collecting data, starting at the Women's March through the midterm elections. I actually also talk about the Women's March 2019 in the conclusion of the book, but this is where the data were collected. So data were collected at all of these events using a methodology that I've been using for a number of years, where we do random sampling of protest participants to survey them. So I collect data in the streets with the protesters, and then I actually follow them back into their districts, looking at the ways they work with organizations. And then the book concludes by talking about follow-up surveys with these protesters, which looks at what they actually did around the midterm elections. And I'm actually in the process of fielding a follow-up survey that's with all of these people who were surveyed originally in the streets during these marches right now, to look at how those people are working around the 2020 elections. And that survey will close on Monday, actually. What's interesting is we actually were able to get a pretty good response rate, even though it's been a long time since the Women's March 2017. Some people would say it's been a lifetime. Okay, so here is just a brief overview of the findings. With regard to looking at the resistance in the streets, what I basically find is, number one, and this has been documented by other people as well, but what we find it's very clear that the core of the American resistance is highly educated, middle-aged white women. They were the majority at every single one of these protest events. And not only did they come out for one protest, but we actually document the ways that people turn out again and again. And I actually worked with a collaborator to do a more in-depth research project, specifically looking at what we call persisters in the resistance, people who come out again and again. And we find that one of the main issues that motivates people to turn out again and again is reproductive rights, which continues to be a big motivator for people out in the streets. At the same time, participants who have been coming out into the streets are motivated by multiple motivations, and they span the progressive issues and vary over time. And what that means is that you'll see people turning out at a women's march who are not motivated only by women's rights or reproductive rights. They're also motivated by a suite of progressive issues, some of which are identity-based and some of which are about kind of general progressive issues such as gerrymandering and voter suppression, or around environmental issues. And one of the things that I've done in the work is mapping out these patterns of motivations, which we see as really different from one march to the next. And it's actually interesting, even if you look across the different waves of the women's marches, the motivations that people report being the reasons that they went out into the streets are different at every single one of those marches. And I just finished collecting data at the women's march that just happened this past weekend across the United States, and looked again at the patterns of motivations. And what's really interesting is the way that the motivations change based on the current political moment. So while, as expected, the people who turned out at the Women's March last weekend were predominantly women, predominantly middle-aged, or actually, predominantly women, predominantly highly educated and white, they were not predominantly middle-aged. And that's, I think, because of the COVID effect, because of the pandemic. So younger people are more comfortable coming out into the streets at this moment. They were all wearing masks, in contrast to what some people have said, and I documented that. But what's really interesting is that while participants reported a high previous participation rate in women's marches, they had a higher previous participation rate in protests since George Floyd was murdered in the United States in the summer. So they had been involved in protests around Black Lives Matter. So these are very much what we think of as the white allies who got involved in the Black Lives Matter movement this summer. And for these women, or these predominantly women, what motivated them was not just reproductive rights and women's rights, but the next highest motivations were equality, were police brutality, and racial justice. So we see how the motivations of the moment, or what's most on the, most concerning them at the moment, is what they're saying is motivating them to take to the streets at that moment. The other thing that I find is that the resistance is extending into the districts. And I document that by looking first at the organizations that are playing a role in mobilizing what I call the resistance in the districts. So these are what I call them resistance groups because they actually call themselves that. Some of which are organizations that started with the election in 2016, and some of which are longer term organizations that redirected some of their efforts specifically around resistance, or responding to the call of resistance that many people were making. And what I talk about when I look at organizing resistance is the way that a lot of the resistance is being coordinated through this new organizational form called distributed organizing, which wasn't really talked about much up until 2016. Distributed organizing is a new style of organizing that focuses not on geographic location of the activist or the person involved, but rather it focuses on digital connections. So pre-existing social ties and location don't matter nearly as much as digital connections. And because of distributed organizing, membership has really changed in terms of membership in organizations. And it also facilitates a move away from the federated structure that has been the hallmark of civic America. So we no longer see civic groups that are following the model of going from local politics to state level politics to federal politics, but rather it's more of a node in this diffuse network. And as I said before, it's geographically diffuse. And the way that a lot of organizers talk to me about it is it enables people who want to be involved in politics to be involved in politics in their pajamas, sitting on their sofa after the kids go to bed while drinking Chardonnay, because you can do it all on your cell phone. And what I found is that the organizational landscape is densely populated with groups with overlapping missions and constituencies, where there's not a lot of brand loyalty necessarily among the members, but the members work with multiple organizations simultaneously. And we're seeing that now as well. I think this is actually distributed organizing has become even more important and more central during this period of the 2020 campaign because of the pandemic, because so many people have shifted away from doing any face-to-face work around politics. So distributed organizing and the tools such as phone banking and text banking are much more important now than they even were back in 2018 when I was studying them. So I also document the resistance in the districts in terms of how the people who have been protesting, how they got involved in politics. And what I specifically look at is how they were working towards the November 2018 midterm election. So we see in May 2018, people were already getting involved in doing much more than just giving money. But by November 2018, I did this follow-up survey right after the midterm election. We find that people were involved in so many different activities, and they were working through numerous groups in the organizational ecosystem, but we see that they also were involved in the Democratic Party. But what's interesting is they weren't really working with the national party per se. Most of the people reported working with individual candidates' campaigns or with very local or hyper-local branches of the Democratic Party. So finally, just to wrap up here, and this is my quick run through the book. The inauguration of Donald Trump and his presidency have been a shot in the arm to democracy. Being able to unite against a common enemy has turned out participants again and again across the progressive spectrum and beyond it as well. Groups have emerged to fill a policy void that was left by the Democratic Party, and they take advantage of distributed organizing that facilitates outreach beyond your local community and state. In fact, as somebody who lives in Maryland, where my community is completely, blanketed with Joe Biden signs right now, I can tell you that there are so many efforts by these organizations to try to get people living in blue areas like mine to get involved by using digital tools to work in other places. And, my big decision is, am I going to help out in North Carolina or am I going to help out in West Virginia starting this weekend? Finally, the resistance provides very clear evidence of the connections between social movements and electoral politics. Protests have become the beginning of a movement, and protests are really different in that protests are no longer grounded in one city. Although marching on Washington still tends to be a battle cry for the resistance, people mobilize and take part in protests in many different locations across the country, and they don't need a lot of lead up time because so much of this is coordinated digitally. So the American resistance tracks these people from the streets into their districts to work on electoral politics. And what's really interesting about that is just because the book ended in 2018 doesn't mean the resistance ended. So I continue to study the resistance through the election. And this is just a list of the resistance that I've been documenting since the 2018 midterms. And this isn't even all of them, but you'll see that there's been a lot of activity since August, or even during the summer. We saw the George Floyd protests breaking out. We call them that, but they basically are in response to George Floyd being murdered at the end of May. And basically since then, although it's not on my diagram as such, protests have been sustained over this period of time around issues of police brutality and Black Lives Matter. But you see these other events as well. And it's very likely there'll be more resistance taking place depending on the outcome of the election in less than 2 weeks from now. And my plan is to be in the streets to document it and see where the American resistance goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. I just want to ask you to situate your research, if you can zoom out a little bit, in the general political landscape of the United States, which is to say you make specific reference to the void left by the Democratic Party. And I suppose that the question would be, what is this void and what has been the political significance of this void?
Well, thank you for asking that. So basically, the American resistance emerged out of this period of time when the Democratic Party had really atrophied. So I actually, in my second book, which was called Activism, Inc., that came out in 2006, talked specifically about how the Democratic Party had basically pulled away from local politics and was using these more instrumental techniques for trying to mobilize people to get out and participate in elections without actually creating any type of lasting infrastructure in communities. And when the 2008 election happened, there was a lot of discussion about how the Obama campaign had filled this void and built really lasting infrastructure at the community level. It used the Camp Obama efforts, as well as a bunch of other campaign tactics to really build connections in local communities. And these were relational politics, not digital. What we saw is that the digital tools of the MIBO, which was My barackobama.com website, channel people from their digital tools into doing real live in-person activities. Unfortunately, what happened after that, and it unfortunately was well documented as well, was that the campaign infrastructure got absorbed into the Democratic Party and was left to atrophy, and was only asked, really, instead of participating the way it had been during the 2008 election, it had really been turned into an income generating tool for the Democratic Party. So once again, this infrastructure at the local level was just asked to be a fundraising technique. And as a result, we didn't see a lot of calls for people at the local level in communities, be they blue, purple, red, whatever communities, to get involved in their local politics. So we saw very little of the local Democratic Party that was part of what the party was originally designed to do. And in fact, there were some efforts to establish, a 50-state strategy where the Democratic Party would work in all 50 states. But by the time we get to 2016, even though there had been these efforts, most of them had been unsuccessful. And what we see instead is that in most states, you don't even see the party working to try to mobilize voters. It just identified these targeted swing states, and that's where almost all the efforts went. So by the time we see the inauguration in 2017 in January, many people are looking to get involved in politics and they don't see the party there at all. So a lot of these organizations emerge, such as Indivisible, probably most notably, but also groups like Swing Left, March On, the Women's March as well, all got involved to try to build some type of relational politics for people on the ground in their communities. And in fact, there are some great stories about women who got involved in the Women's March, getting back on buses to go home and deciding to found chapters of either Indivisible or other groups in their communities to start to do civic work on the buses home from the Women's March in 2017. And what came out of that is a lot of these groups trying to go in and get people involved in doing stuff and connecting together locally in their communities. And it's been, relatively successful. I mean, there have been lots of discussions about the degree to which those organizations are also still not, are still not building enough connections, but we see a lot of those connections persisting all the way through the 2020 election. And there have been lots of accounts of people talking about how they're actually getting involved in their communities and they're following the COVID rules in their communities. And rather than canvassing with Joe Biden, who decided he wasn't going to canvass during this election because of COVID, they're getting involved in doing campaigning through their local people who are running for office, which is really what American politics was supposed to be about. All politics was local, and all politics, stopped being local somewhere along the way, at least on the Democratic side. And in a lot of ways, we see this reinvigoration of local politics happening. And part of that is through the resistance and the resistance groups specifically.
I just want to add some thoughts of my own on this, just to contextualize it even further. Thank you for that analysis. Speaking as someone who became, I suppose, a member of the resistance, like many others in 2016, at the New York level, I was very interested in the New York state legislature. I think that one context for the rise of what I suppose you could call grassroots politics on the Democratic side, it has been the complete failure of the Democratic National Party to win elections for 25 years. I mean, this is a party which has the best policies, produces the best outcomes when in power, and yet it's incapable of winning elections. And it has been the culture of the Democratic Party, both officially and unofficially, to, as it were, trust the party to win elections. And I think that my sense was that trust was broken in 2016. And grassroots, ordinary Democrats, ordinary Americans saw that they had to organize themselves because the Democratic Party was not going to do that, simply had no capacity for doing that, or maybe not even the will to do it. And I think one thing I'd like to add to your timetable, Dana, of the 2016 to 2018, is this note, essentially, which is that the 2018 midterms were not just the 2018 midterms, they were what became known as the Blue Wave. There was a massive victory for Democrats across the board, especially at the local levels. And it seems obvious that this victory was the result of grassroots distributed organizing that you've been talking about, and not the result of a kind of top-down strategic Democratic Party effort. In fact, Nancy Pelosi specifically made the decision, I think the very wise one, to let the grassroots handle this. And it's the first time that I can remember when the grassroots have handled it, and as a consequence have won. And there's lots of writing about how important durable power, how important it is to gain durable power, to have a successful and vibrant grassroots of the kind that you've been describing. Now I want to ask you about the post-2018. So the grassroots wins 2018. The Democrats win the House of Representatives. Nancy Pelosi is suddenly in charge of stuff again. And I noticed that there was, from my own involvement, that there was a kind of reflexive sort of, on the one hand, protests did continue and activity did continue, but there was a reflexive sort of deference, as it were, to Nancy Pelosi and to the Democrats in the House to impeach and to drive the agenda of the Democratic Party with, as we know, almost no results. You know, what we kept being told by the Democratic Party in the House was, well, you have to vote again, you have to keep organizing. But I noticed during that time that the hashtag resist declined online. The self-consciousness of the resistance, as it were, waned, even as their activities continued. So the brand of the resistance was diluted by the fact that Democrats now held the House of Representatives, which was an important. Whereas before, for 2 years, Democrats have been completely excluded from from federal government. So I suppose what I want to ask you is there still a resistance, or is what we're seeing something else? Even as the personnel is the same, even as the same people are protesting and organizing, is it still accurate to talk about the resistance? Particularly with a view to the election coming up in 2 weeks' time?
A very, very comprehensive comment and question. So thank you for that. Let's see. I mean, I want to just go back and say that it's completely true about the failings of the Democratic Party in terms of the non-federal level of elections, and that's something I should have noted, because if you looked, there was this very strong effort on the right through dark money, as well as beyond dark money, to continue to win elections locally. And the Republican Party really was amazingly successful at that, while the Democratic Party failed miserably. And you can see that up through 2016. With regard to the question about the resistance and if it's something else entirely, I believe, I agree with you, there was this reflection point after 2018. In fact, I wrote an op-ed that I could not place right after the 2018 election saying, will the resistance fall into the graveyard of democratic politics, right? Because because what we find is that protest movements usually die out when Democrats win, and Democrats won. So was that going to be the end of the resistance? And within 2 weeks, people were organizing protests, and the Lights for Liberty event happened. And these were smaller events, but I think a lot of the people took this moment and reflected, and they thought, okay, we've got Pelosi, we have a Democratic-led Congress, the squad has won, right? We have some progressive candidates in there starting to cause some good trouble. So let's see what happens. And I think everybody became really disillusioned really quickly. And so I see it as kind of an inflection point before the resistance started, gaining steam once again. And also recognizing that there was a sense, at least among the people who had been out in the streets, that I found in my follow-up survey data, where they realized that actually, institutional, normal democratic politics was not going to solve the problems that they were identifying in America. And so many of them, first of all, tended to bank left. And you can see that I could see that in my data, but you could also see that in the fact that Indivisible was very supportive. If you looked at their scorecard of Elizabeth Warren, and most groups were much more leaning towards the left. And we saw that in the individual level as well as the organizational level. And so what's really interesting is now that we have, Team Biden running for the election in 2 weeks, the question that I think exists for me is not, is this the resistance? I mean, I think the resistance has gotten in line behind these candidates, and they're putting in all their energy in helping to get them to win. At the same time, they're working really hard to get the Democrats to take over the Senate. So we'll be coming into a situation like Obama came into in 2008, where basically the Democrats could hold all parties, all of the houses of Congress, as well as the presidency, which is a wonderful opportunity to legislate. The question is, what will successfully be legislated, and will it be sufficient to, I guess, defang the resistance? Or is the resistance going to be used to push the discussion to the left? I think that all bets are off about what will happen in that situation. I think right now, most people are more worried and more preparing themselves to have to take to the streets and perhaps fight back if Trump is refusing to leave the White House. I think there's much more discussion about that. But I think this other question is important. What will happen to the resistance if the polls are right this time?
And so just to approach that question, I just want you to dwell on the current relationship between Biden and the grassroots, which is my own word for the resistance, and the grassroots are, as you mentioned, indivisible, swing left, and all these, even Moms Demand, all these disparate Black Lives Matters, various groups that have in common a dissatisfaction with the set status quo and an agenda that isn't simply restricted to their particular concerns, but also, I suspect, connected to a sense that it's time that the principal vehicle for their concerns, the Democratic Party, has to start behaving like a party that's interested in taking power and actually doing things. What's your assessment of Biden's grasp of that political reality, which, in other words, we have, and I just want to mention one other fact, which I think is important, which is this question of Act Blue. Act Blue is an online donation platform which enables somebody in Alaska to donate to somebody in a race in Georgia. It raised I have the stats here somewhere, it raised $1.6 billion for the midterm elections in 2018. That's $1.6 billion from ordinary people. That tells you how invested ordinary people are at the moment in the Democratic cause. $1.6 billion is $400 million more than Hillary Clinton raised in her presidential campaign in 2016. We have raised for 2020, they haven't even tallied it, but billions of dollars. Now, that level of ownership of the party, I think, has come to the notice, or must come to the notice of Joe Biden. So I suppose my question is, bearing in mind all of these facts, in other words, the successful track record, the winning track record of the resistance, the huge financial clout that the resistance now has, what has been its effect on Biden's campaign, first of all, and second of all, on what would appear to be his embryonic agenda in the event that he wins?
Well, so I'm going to make guesses here with my crystal ball because it's unclear. What I can tell you based on what we know so far.
Oh. I think has Dana frozen? Eric?
I think that she has. Yes. Let's see.
So maybe if we message her.
Yeah. Yeah. She has. Maybe she will be able to drop out and come back in. Let's see.
Well, I mean, while we're doing that, I just want to offer some thoughts on the question.
Yeah, please.
That I raised. I think Dana will be back in a minute. I'm actually desperate to hear what she has to say about it.
Likewise.
So I have my thoughts, but as we all do, we all have everyone watching will have their thoughts on this. But I'm actually quite interested. But Dana's the one who's been talking to nonstop to a lot of people, and so she has information that we don't have.
Mm-hmm.
But my sense of it is that the stakes are extremely high for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
I feel that if the Democratic Party does not, as it were, become a vehicle for the resistance, for the grassroots, rather than for the corporations, as has been the case, then it has a huge problem on its hands as a viable political party. So I think those are the stakes. But anyway, back, Dana, you froze completely. We were desperate to hear what you had to say.
Hopefully I froze on a good note. Yeah, I don't know what happened. I just got kicked off my Wi-Fi. I apologize. That's never actually happened before. So I was saying something about the task force. Did any of
No,
that?
we didn't pick that. You froze right at the beginning of your answer. You said you were looking into the crystal ball, but
Oh no, and then I was like, I got okay. Sorry about
You got
that.
sucked into the crystal ball.
yeah,
Okay, so in
apparently
the
that was
crystal ball, I went on and talked about the crystal ball for quite some time before I realized. I apologize. So in the crystal ball, what I think is really interesting to think about going backwards is that, Biden actually originally ran when he was running for the nomination in the primaries on a very centrist platform, right? Which a lot of people, particularly people on the left, people in the resistance, were not particularly supportive of. And what we see is since he got the nomination, I mean, many people were unhappy when all of these people dropped out and basically got in line behind Biden. And so what Biden's team did, which I think was brilliant, is they put together the Biden-Sanders task force, which, as you may recall, during 2016, there was no Clinton-Sanders task force to try to reconcile the differences in the platforms. But in this case, they did. And in so doing, not only did Biden bring in a bunch of the delegates who were supportive of Bernie Sanders, they also brought in a bunch of civic leaders who were involved in certain platforms. And particularly here, I noticed that there were a lot of groups that were involved in the youth climate movement to push him on climate, et cetera, and so forth. So what we saw is a platform that emerged that was much more left-leaning than what Biden ran on during the primaries. And that platform has moved forward, so we continue to see that. Now, I think it was yesterday or the day before, Biden also was rumored to be discussing with a bunch of Republicans possibility of joining his administration if he wins. And many people on the left were up in arms about that and whether or not he should be, trying to stretch across the aisle at this point, et cetera, and so forth. And with my crystal ball, it's hard to say. I mean, Biden has a history of bipartisan ruling. I mean, that's his nature. That's the way that he had made a name for himself politically as a politician in his long career. So I expect that we're going to see him trying to work with people who identify as Republican, but are, open to some of his policy positions. How that's going to sit with, what you're calling this constituency that's been basically funding people all over the country to get them out of office and also supporting progressive candidates who ran against incumbent Democrats. That's going to be a really hard place to be. But so far, I've been actually really impressed with Biden and the degree to which he's been able to bank left and put his policies where his claims are. Of course, it's always great before one takes office. You don't know what he's going to start with and how the legislative agenda is going to fall out. But I think there are some hopeful notes here. That said, it'll be very interesting to see how the people who have been active on the left, the people who've been most active in the resistance, how they respond to a Biden administration. Do they go back and just sit back down on their couches and start watching, reality television again and stop paying attention again, which is where a lot of them were, and they told me all about it when I originally talked to them at the Women's March 2017? I don't think so, but I do know a lot of people have been posting these messages about how, vote in November so you don't have to pay attention anymore. And that, I think, is a really dangerous message to have, because whatever comes out of this election, there is going to be a huge response on the right that will start at the local level because there is infrastructure there and will be used to try to take back any progress that's made. So I think that this is a long fight, a long battle maybe. And the first step is, what happens on November 3rd.
There's one feature which I really want to emphasize, I'm not emphasizing, I really want to ask you about, which is quite extraordinary in my opinion, which is women. We're seeing this extremely kind of historically kind of unprecedented, I think, division between women and men in this country, with the women voting for and acting for the Democrats and the men acting for the Republicans. That distribution being, of course, complicated by questions of race and class as well. But essentially, we've seen this outstanding feature, namely a very salient feature, which is the role of women. And could you comment on that? I mean, it's just something we've never seen before. I mean, if you're doing a sociology of politics, you just don't really ask yourselves, how are women thinking about this and how are men thinking about it? That's not a division which we're used to. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that the distinction here that really is notable is not about gender and urban people as much as suburban people and rural people, because what we saw, Donald Trump won by getting whites outside of urban centers to support him, women and men. And what we see now is, so the resistance ended up being fueled by a bunch of women who originally called for this march on Washington because they were outraged by what they saw during the campaign and the way women were being treated, the way Hillary Clinton was being treated, the way Pantsuit Nation was treated. And they took to Facebook and they organized this huge march, which took place, across the country and even around the world. And basically, since then, women have led organizations, they've run for office, and they've gotten much more politically involved. What's notable here, though, is that, I was studying this stuff before 2016. And in urban areas, we saw that women were kind of leading the way in other civic groups as well. But if you look nationally across movements, most research has found that, during the period of the civil rights era, men were really dominating these movements. And there were even discussions about the sexism within the movement that have been discussed. More recently, like in the 1980s, 1990s, the discussion was that there was parity in terms of participation. But now is the first time that we see women playing this big leadership role. And I think that having, a misogynist in chief really helps make it possible to continue to fuel, to fan the flames of outrage that, fueled the resistance in the first place. And the fact that Donald Trump continues to talk to women in horrible ways, to attack women, and to use social media to do it frequently. Although we get to see some of that at the debates too. We're going to get to see it with the 60 Minutes interview as well. Is basically that helped continue to get women who say, okay, I'm done now. I'm going to sit down. I've got other things to worry about. It keeps them involved. So I think that thinking through the role of women is really important. And I know that from polls that have recently come out, we see women are much more supportive of Biden than men outside of urban areas. And, it'll be hard to say what we're going to really see once we see the election closing, since the election's, I already voted, the election's done for me, but for many people have voted early. In fact, they voted, early in amazing, like groundbreaking numbers, but that's partially due to the pandemic rather than due to the fact of this election. So it's just, there's so many intervening things taking place right now. But what I think is really important to note is that so many women are leading groups and so many women have gotten involved and have used politics to connect themselves to other women. And that's going to continue. And that's really, it's unprecedented. So it's unclear how that will play out because it's very different from the ways that we've seen civic groups and civic networks form in the past. But I think that we'll continue to see that. And I think that we'll continue to see that also in representation in politics, because still there is such a huge gender gap. If you look at representation in the Senate, still in the House to some degree, in local politics, at the legislature level. So that will be part of this process of the wave where there, is a wave of women also taking office.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that the fact that women are involved, and in particular, the kind of educated women that you're talking about, highly capable women, multitasking women who are used to sort of running families, doing jobs, have suddenly been switched on to politics. They're like, oh God, I've got to take care of this as well now. I don't think that's going away. I think there are structured relationships, structured organizations, there are conversations happening that aren't just going to evaporate. And I should only add, and there's one more question I have to ask of you. I should think that the best news for Democrats, in my opinion, would be if Donald Trump would, first of all, defeated, and second of all, remained on the scene in some significant way. Because so long as he's the head of the, lock him up and all the rest of it, that's actually counterproductive. We need Donald Trump even much more than the Republicans do. So if he stays on the scene, if he has his own TV show, I think that's fantastic news for Democrats, because he will continue to, as it were, shock people into action. It's going to be exhausting, but in the long term, we need. So my final question, I guess, for me is what, and I guess everyone watching will be interested to know this. What's your take on what's going to happen in 2 weeks' time?
Whether we're going to have a civil war or not, or who's going to win the election?
What do you think is going to happen? Are we going to? I'm a Democrat. Are we going to win this, or is Trump going to win it, or are we going to win it and it's going to be stolen from us? Those are the three, I think, scenarios.
Well, it's funny. So in December 2019, I wrote a piece for Time Magazine saying we'll see, the resistance will get confrontational if Donald Trump wins. And I didn't think for a second that there was going to be this option of if the Democrat wins, but Donald Trump refuses to leave office. I think, I think that the popular vote will absolutely go towards Biden. I think that's an easy one to guess. Because of the polling numbers, because he's been polling up consistently and way for much larger amounts as well as for a longer period of time than Hillary Clinton did, and she won the popular vote. It's looking very likely that Joe Biden will also win the Electoral College at this point, because at least from what I've seen from the different models, it'll be impressive if the Republicans are able to gain back enough support at this point to win the Electoral College. But I'm not going to make any commitments, because I was the one who let my kids stay up late in the 2016 election, and then I had to send them to bed early, immediately when Hillary lost Florida, and it became clear to me that it was going to be a bloodbath. So I'm not making any predictions there, but I can say with certainty, I think it's very likely given the numbers right now. Of course, we don't know I'm sure there's going to be a surprise. We still have time for an October surprise. But hopefully everybody's prepared for that. So there's that question. Now, what happens? Let's say that Biden wins, and he wins somewhere in the middle of what's being predicted right now from the polls. Will Trump actually leave? I think, it's interesting because I've actually been in the streets preparing for times when people were predicting that he was, that there was going to be a huge white supremacist rally in Washington, D.C., for example, and only 15 people showed up. But there have also been times when we've seen big turnout. And I remember at the Women's March 2017, I had some of my students who usually help me collect data said they were afraid because, Bikers for Trump said they were going to come and beat up people who were protesting. And so, but they never showed up. I didn't survey one of them in the crowd. Nobody in my team saw one of them. Nobody saw them. So they weren't there. Anyway, all that being said, I still think it's very likely we're going to see confrontation in the streets. It may not be in the streets here in DC. There are lots of groups that are preparing for there to be confrontation in the streets of DC if the Trump administration refuses to leave or go quietly and follow political norms as well as social norms. I think that it's even more likely we're going to see confrontation in cities in other parts of the country. And I just hope that the country, I hope that democracy in America can handle it, right? Because I think these are challenges to democracy and democratic norms that are so important to the foundation of the way that the system works. It's not very helpful.
I think that's very helpful. I'm a bit worried about what you're saying about street confrontations. I just want to add my own gloss to that, since I sort of think about these things a lot. There isn't really a question of Donald Trump refusing to leave, as if he's not a 5-year-old child who'll just say, "I'm staying in this building. You're going to have to escort me out." That's not the issue. What will likely happen in terms of this ominous threat is that he will declare victory. That's very different from just refusing to leave. He will declare victory, and he will issue various orders to various organs of the federal government to enforce his victory and defeat the false claims of victory being made by Joe Biden. That's how a coup would play out. And so I don't see it happening so much on the street level, although I think it could, especially with police and with protests and with federal agencies like ICE and the Custom and Border Patrol, these kind of Trump loyalist.
Proud Boys, don't forget the Proud Boys.
And the Proud Boys. Well, I mean, I've always wondered, here's a question, people talk about the Proud Boys, but how many Proud Boys are there?
Well, when he was in the hospital here, he was in the hospital right near here when he was in Walter Reed for COVID, right by my house. So I drove by because the Proud Boys were there. There were about 15 people.
That's what I'm saying. The Proud Boys, I think, are a media concoction. I feel like I don't know anyone who's ever really met a Proud Boy, whereas I know everyone, you know me. So I'm not too worried about the Proud Boys. I'm worried about the state agencies and the litigation, and then the whole thing boiling down to a judicial kind of coup, a judicially assisted coup, which I think is quite possible with Barrett on the court. So I think that's what I'm thinking about. And without much agency, I hasten to add, what agency do I have in relation to that? And I guess the answer to that is, the only agency I have is in relation to my own party. I can try and pressure the Democrats to show some spine. They will not show spine, as we saw from the Barrett confirmation fiasco. They will not do that unless they are under unless they fear the Democratic base more than they fear the Republicans. So so I feel my feeling from ordinary Democrats is, think about putting pressure on your elected representatives to take the step, including Biden, by the way, to do what is necessary to see off this particular threat, which doesn't arise, I suppose, I think we should acknowledge, if Biden has a decisive victory, it doesn't arise. I think he's in trouble then. No one's going to help him out.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say to add to that, I think that the biggest challenge there is, and I agree with you, but I think the biggest challenge there is it's really hard to get Democrats to have a threat of pressuring their representatives when it's right after an election, because unfortunately, there's not a lot that the base can do right after an election. I mean, because there's 2 more years before any big elections are happening. That all being said, I do think that the people who got engaged since 2016 and have stayed so vigilant in paying attention, I think that they'll be watching in a way that they weren't before. And as a result, I think we could expect to see much more pressure on Democrats. And I do think just the fact that progressives have beaten out incumbents this cycle, as well as in 2018, is a good sign that we'll continue to see that kind of pressure from the left, which is really needed.
So we have a few questions that have come in, and I'll try to, we had one question that kind of was very similar in the direction of the kind of conversation that you just were having. So I'll try to steer this in a slightly different direction with the questions. And one question that comes in from a viewer is, if Biden is elected, how will the resistance movement adapt in your estimation? Will resistance groups focus on the 2022 midterms or local elections? Will they push him to the left? So what's your sense about what is the future of the resistance hold in the case that the Democrats take power?
If the Democrats take power, all the organizations right now are preparing for a legislative agenda that involves pressuring the Biden administration and the new Congress to take seriously progressive issues. So, for example, Indivisible is going to push HR 1 and a whole bunch of democracy measures that go against voter suppression and all of these other threats that we've seen to democracy. I know Sunrise and many other climate groups are going to be pushing for legislation that moves us closer to a Green New Deal in terms of any type of recovery act that will be passed. And there's going to be clearly a recovery act at some point after some sort of assistance around COVID. So I don't think that we're going to see resistance groups just shifting over to looking at 2022 right away. I think that they're going to be trying to push for legislation. And I think that most of them will be pushing to the left of what we've seen and what we would have expected from a Biden administration. The question is if the Congress and the administration are going to heed that call. If not, my prediction will be that most of these groups will start pushing to get rid of incumbents who they think are blocking a more progressive agenda.
Joe, do you have anything you want to add to that? Since that's a good, I think, good kind of speculative question.
Well,
We can.
I would only add that I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
And the thing that I think Democrats should bear in mind, that is the party should bear in mind, is that midterm elections are won by your grassroots.
Yeah.
If they reward the grassroots and with the kind of legislation that they're looking for, then they will see. Then they will enter the 2022 midterms, which are very important, obviously, with a lot of confidence. If they frustrate the grassroots, then I think you're going to see a bloodbath, a GOP bloodbath in 2022, because it's going to be extremely difficult to get the kind of agitated and energetic base if they're fighting the Republican Party and their own candidates at the same time. That's simply not, that's why I think the stakes are so high for the Democratic Party now. Their viability, which at the moment hinges on their opposition to Trump, depends going forward on their ability to pay attention to and reward the people who are winning them elections and funding the party. The age of satisfying kind of corporate donors is over. Corporate donors can't shell out $2 billion for a midterm election. Never going to happen. So, and they can't turn out voters. So we're going to see, and I have a feeling that Biden is actually, to be honest, like I'm with Dana on this. I'm pleasantly surprised by how much smarter Biden is, and I guess that's why he won. That's why he's our candidate. Than some of the senators, some of the other senators in the who are seemingly have no clue about the way the party is moving.
So I have there are two more questions and then I think we'll close up. I'll end with the more kind of weedsy question about the research data. And one question that comes in, and since this is an American and French event, someone asked, despite the resistance movements, there was never a general strike or organized protest to Trump's policies, and the French wonder why. Do you have any insights, Dana, into that? Why we haven't seen a more kind of European response?
Well, let me say this: having done one of my sabbaticals at Sciences Po and studied during a big moment of manifestation in Paris, I can say this: the culture of resistance in Paris is very different, or in France is very different from the culture of resistance in the United States. And our unions are much weaker. And there have been rumors of efforts to call for a general strike. The times that people have talked about calling for a general strike, they have been unsuccessful. And as a result, I think the unions that do exist are really hesitant to call for it, because there's the one thing worse than calling a strike, or than not calling a strike, is calling a strike and then it not working and people going, everything's the same. So we don't see that in this country. I think that if we see the kind of breakdown that is a possible trajectory after the election, I think we could see strikes, because unions are overwhelmingly, I think, in support of the Biden campaign, except for, I think, the police maybe. And as a result, there is a unification. I did this actually reminds me of one thing. I want to go back to what Joe was saying that I think is worth noting here when we think about what comes next, is just that one of the things I talk about in the book is the degree to which the strength of resistance is the fact that it is this fragile coalition of groups and people who are motivated by a range of issues across the progressive spectrum. It's easy to identify Trump and his administration as an enemy. It's going to be a lot harder when people are trying to parse out what universal health care looks like, or what the minimum wage should be, or how to address the degree to which there should be a Green New Deal, and how much bailout should be available to individuals and small business owners, or whatever it's going to be, right? So that's going to actually pull apart this coalition really quickly, and figuring out how they work well together. And unions play a huge part in that. We have seen unions in the streets, but not like you see unions in the streets in France, but more like they have a table at a protest, or they were on, you know, the unions right in front of the AFL-CIO building in Washington, D.C., which is on Black Lives Matter Plaza. They were out giving out shirts every day of protest during the summer. But that's really different from marching and calling for a general strike and enforcing and implementing a general strike. And I don't know if we'll see that. I think that's very hard in our country, particularly because of the two-party system. So, I mean, perhaps, you know, the other option I think is that we see that the Democratic Party, and this goes to a lot of what Joe's been talking about, the Democratic Party could just fall apart and break into a bunch of different parties. That might actually be better for democracy in our country. I'm sure now I'm going to be on a blacklist for people, but nonetheless, you know, you can see how that actually could provide a really interesting alternative future that would enable more variation in progressive politics, which might be really useful.
So this is, I'll give you this final question and then we'll wrap it up. And so somebody asks, Black women have historically voted extremely strongly for Democrats. They showed up for Hillary and they're showing up for Biden. Do you think it's important to distinguish what women you survey? So what is the role of kind of race and identity play in the kind of research program?
Well, so originally that is an important question. So originally, the data that I collected through the midterm elections were predominantly with white people. And one of the things when I was doing the original conversations with people, I went to a bunch of purple places and gave book talks. And one of the things that I asked everybody, I said, you know, the big question is, how are people of color? Where are people of color? They don't really have a position or a role in the resistance. They're not really playing an active role. And I think that this summer, after the murder of George Floyd, and what came after that, what we saw was that people of color went out in the streets all over the country, and resistance groups called for their members to go out in solidarity, and people joined them. So that, like Doug McAdam, who's been studying the civil rights movement for, you know, decades and decades, basically said he's never seen anything like it in terms of the diversity of the crowds around racial justice. And, you know, I saw it because a lot of the people whom I originally surveyed at these other marches were now in the streets in solidarity. And they continue to talk about this. So when I look at the motivations now, the motivations have shifted so that they're more in line with what Black Americans are concerned about, or at least Black progressive Americans. And so I think that when I look at my data prior to 2018, there are very few, I mean, there are more Black women than there are men of color, but still, most of the people are white in the sample. They're around 77% white across the board, which also happens to be the percentage, you know, it's a percentage breakdown racially when you look at people with BAs or higher, and it happens to be that everybody just about has, you know, an undergraduate degree, which is in contrast to the fact that only a third of the American population has an undergraduate degree. So this is a highly educated group of people. But since then, what we've seen is not only the Black Lives Matter and protests against structural or systemic racism, but also in the climate movement, we saw a lot more racial diversity. So I think that there, you know, very much people of color are involved here. They'll be voting for Biden, but they're also getting involved in politics. A lot more of it is focusing on the militarization of the police and responding to that than it is around, you know, reproductive rights per se. But it's all part of this cluster at the moment, which is part of this, you know, interesting coalition. What that means again after the election, because the priorities of the different constituencies within the resistance is going to be very different in terms of like thinking, for example, about what should go first in terms of what legislation you start with, which is always a big issue, you know, when there's a Democrat coming to office. I suppose a Republican too, but I mostly study the Democrats, so I think more about that.
So do either of you have any final thoughts that you want to impart? I guess we can all hope that we go to bed Tuesday, you know, November 3rd, much happier than we did 4 years ago.
We're not going to have an outcome then.
Yeah.
I mean, the one thing I would say is I think that it's remarkable, this early voting. And I've never voted early before. And, you know, you're able to actually look up. So I'm tracking my ballot. My ballot has now been has been received, but not yet accepted. So they're vetting. And you actually, in 42 states, you can actually track your ballot and see where it is and see if it gets accepted. And what's interesting is,
Sorry, I'm interrupting you in order to amplify something, a tweet you did today, Dana. And I don't want it to get lost.
okay.
The one thing that we can do as grassroots activists between now and November is precisely what you're talking about, which is to remind voters who have voted mail-in that mail-in ballots get rejected at remarkable rates, number one. And number two, that they can check the fate of their mail-in ballot. And as third-party people, we can encourage that process. So in other words, if you're thinking to yourself, what can I do between now and November the 3rd? Read Dana's tweet of this morning.
I actually, so that
came with like a flashlight. I was so grateful for that.
Oh, I'm so glad. I mean, so I wrote this piece with Laura Putnam in the American Prospect that talks about how distributed organizing only works so far. And to be honest, you know, I know a lot of people, including my sister, whom I adore, who is currently calling into other states to tell people who to vote for. And I gotta say that, like, I don't want to hear from people in other states about whom I should support in an election. Nobody does. So this idea, it used to be, you know, the parachuting people into the communities, but now people are just calling in from other states telling you what to do. And I don't think that works. There's not a lot of evidence that that will be a successful effort to get out the vote and to support a candidate you want to support. But there are these efforts now where you can actually help phone bank for people who had their ballots rejected, to tell them that, because a lot of times people aren't checking, tell them that their ballot was rejected so they can actually go and fix it and actually still vote, because it's not too late for that. And so I'm trying, that's my big thing, is I'm gonna be doing that, and I'm actually trying to motivate people who want to help out. Like, I live in this super blue area, so I can't really, I mean, I can remind people to vote, but I know how the vote's going to go here. So instead of basically calling people in, you know, I don't know, Kentucky and telling them who I think they should vote for, I think it's better, my time is better served calling people in North Carolina or Florida who had their ballots rejected, telling them that and reminding them they can still vote, because I think a lot of people don't know that. I only learned that recently. So I'm glad you found that useful.
Very useful.
Yeah. Well, on that note, everybody get out and vote, and make sure your vote counts. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to especially thank Dana and Joe for being our speakers and participating in this great series. And we look forward to doing it again next year, hopefully next year in Paris. So thank you all very much. Thanks to Joelle and her team at the Columbia Global Center in Paris. And we'll see you all soon again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye, thank you.